Hello, everyone. I'm gonna wait for you to start arriving in a couple of minutes. Just for everybody to start getting ready and comfortable for this exciting lecture. I remind you that this lecture is part of a collaboration in between SAI Ethical Exchange and the Design School of the London College of Communication, UAL. And this is part of a design award that is organized around AI ethics. And the Design Award have a companion of lectures and workshops, and this is one of them. I'm very excited today because we have amazing guest speakers. I want to introduce you to Veronica Crow. She's a research fellow and lecturer at the Institution for Consumer Informatics at University of Siegen and the University of Applied Science of Bonn-Rhein-Sieg. Excuse my German. Her work focuses on interaction design and design practices beyond the desktop, specifically augmented and virtual reality. She researched technology acceptance and on ethical design for XR, with a focus in dark patterns. Her work was published at human-computer interaction and augmented reality big conferences. And Professor Alexander Bodden is the director of the Institute of Consumer Informatics at the Bonn-Rhein-Sieg University of Applied Science. And he is a cultural anthropologist and ethnologist. And since 2013, Alex has been a project manager at the Fraunhofer Institute of Applied Information Technology in the field of user-centered design. His research interests are digital consumption and consumer protection, as well as sustainable and ethical innovation. So I'm very excited with your presentation. I think everybody's looking forward. I think that naturally the conversation in the studio have been leading some of the things into the conversations of consumer protection. So I leave you with the floor, and I open the floor again at the end of your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so I start sharing.
Yeah, great. Shall I start to say something, Veronica? So we
Yes.
didn't rehearse how we would like to do the beginning, just that I should do the first part of the talk. So hello, everybody. It's great to be here today. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. And yeah, today we will be talking about consumer informatics and specifically the question of consumer protection in emerging technology in the relation of dark patterns. That is some work that Veronica has been pursuing very intensely over the last years as part of her PhD project, and I'm collaborating with her. And in our talk today, we will first talk a little bit, this will be my role, to talk a little bit about what is consumer informatics and what are these emerging trends and technologies that we look into in our research. And then Veronica, as a second part, will basically present a case study from her research, which is concerned about dark patterns and the role of mixed reality. And yeah, then we will wrap up in the end a little bit. So like, yeah, what does this all mean, what we have found out there, and how to proceed with it. Okay, so let's first talk a little bit about consumer informatics. So like we have, so you maybe ask yourself, what is consumer informatics? The term is relatively new. It has been around in just for a couple of years in Germany, where we call it a Verbraucherinformatik, which is kind of like a hyphen word. So informatics has this thing of making interdisciplinary research with other domains. So initially we are coming from business informatics, meaning so this discipline that is concerned about how computers are used in organizations and companies. And their consumers, of course, play kind of also a role, but only they are usually also only seen from a business perspective, where we see them as customers of an organization. Then in informatics, we have also, of course, we are thinking about consumers in another role as users of technology. So there we are mainly in the field of human-computer interaction, and the question that maybe you also, I heard that lots of you students are designers, so I'm sure you're thinking a lot also about consumers, but mainly in the role as users of the technologies that you design. So the people that actually have to deal with the stuff that you bring out into the world. But in Germany, at least, there's another domain that is very interested in consumer, the classical consumer research, which is also an interdisciplinary field, which looks into consumers as active or as actors, so to say, in society. So basically households as a unit in which our societies are organized, and the questions on how they behave, how they learn about new things, questions about consumer protection are interesting there, and all these things. And of course, there we have observed that in the last decade or so, ever since the invention of the smartphone at the latest, or the iPhone by Apple, that digital devices and computer technologies have very much entered into the everyday life of consumers, and that is something where we see an interconnection between where we see consumer informatics at this intersection between the consumer research and the business informatics and HCI work that we have been doing in the past. So, and we're doing this in a couple of different fields. So mostly we have been interested lately in mobility projects, where we see like how we can manage the transition towards a more sustainable society. We have done works on food, like how digital tools maybe shape the way we learn about new recipes, or how we share knowledge about food consumption and things like that. We have looked into the home, of course, the classical households, like questions of smart home and digital consumption in private contexts. And lately, we have also been doing some work on life admin. So all this administrative work that you have to do as a private household, and that is also increasingly digitized. So like things like getting a new contract, or doing your tax returns, or filing some insurance claims or stuff like that, all this office work that you do in the private context. And we also have some cross-cutting issues that we are always very interested in. The one is this classical topic of consumer protection that we will also talk about today. So the question is, what does it do with consumers when we digitize their everyday life? What kind of protection do they need from the power of companies, for instance, or how do these technical innovations and interventions change our life world, so to say? And the other cross-cutting theme is that of sustainability. So like what does this all mean for our transition towards a more sustainable and more livable planet, hopefully. So if you are interested to see more, you can go to our website, Verbraucherinformatik, the German term, so for consumer informatics, verbraucherinformatik.de. But we have a couple of things are also in English translations there, so you should be could take a look there if you wanted. So, but now up to the topic. So today we want to talk about consumer protection in emerging fields. So like if we look into how our technological world has developed over the last decades, then there have been very early visions already in the 90s, something like ubiquitous computing, where Mark Weiser has foreseen a future where we can all not only interact with a single computer that's sitting on the desk in an office context, but also where we interact with various devices, where computers are so cheap and omnipresent that they are basically everywhere. And the second big trend that is kind of the foundation of what we are interested in today is this topic of the Internet of Things, which has been first coined by Kevin Ashton in the, I think, early 2000s. And Internet of Things, which means basically that we have small computers that they are so cheap that we can build them into little smart things, and then these smart things kind of have a digital connection and a digital representation in the virtual world. And the second cool thing that you can do is that these sensors and actuators can do smart things and collect data, which means that not anymore a human has to sit there and enter a lot of data into the computer, but the world can basically enter its own data. And this enables a lot of business applications. It's basically the basis for this concept of big data. And if you want, also the basis for all these nice AI applications that we can see today, which depend on huge amounts of data for the machine learning models to be trained on. So these visions were first very focused on work context, like you can also maybe see on this nice image here. So this is from Mark Weiser's ubiquitous computing vision, so to say. So like people interacting with stuff in an office environment. But today we can also see that these technologies have increasingly entered our private homes, so the consumer households. So nowadays, I think we can say that this vision of the ubiquitous computing has become a reality, more or less. So probably most of you will not have one single computer, but a lot of computers. You have probably one of these smart little things in your pocket, which is a very powerful computer. You maybe have a tablet to consume digital media or to read or to work for university. You have maybe a laptop, and maybe if you have another computer for playing games on, like a console or maybe a gaming PC. Many of you maybe have also some wearable devices like a Fitbit for measuring like your heart rate when you work out, or you might have a smartwatch connected to your smartphones for receiving notifications on your hand. I think Veronica is one of those, so you maybe can show it. Yeah, that is. And of course, we also have like IoT devices. So maybe the smart fridge is the kind of the big example that's maybe not so much a reality as it has been not turned out to be that useful yet, but there are a lot of other devices that are connected to the internet that you can buy that are very cheap, like smart light bulbs that can change the color, or like a scale where you can measure your weight and it sends it directly to your app. And yeah, you will have trouble today maybe finding a television set that is not connected with some smart technologies or stuff like that. So we are kind of in a world full of computers. And this doesn't only rely to this Internet of Things qualities, that we have some connections and there's some data sent around, but also affects the way how we interact with computers, because computers are everywhere, and because we have so many advancements in the way also we do interaction with computers. So it's not anymore so that we sit in front of a desk and have to type in things into a keyboard, but you can also interact with computers in very different other ways, like using voice control, for instance, or there could be really a passive form of interaction, like when a computer just monitors where you are based on some sensor readings. And of course, also there are new ways we interact with computers that like transition a little bit the virtual with the physical world. And that is something that Veronica will introduce to you later in more detail on this example of augmented or virtual reality application. So that means a little bit, so all these technical advances have changed a little bit the way what it even means to interact with a computer. And the second thing that's also related to the theme of this lecture series is, of course, that nowadays we are not only interacting with computers as devices that have a screen or some other input thing where we can enter and receive data, but when we use such a device, we are usually connected with a whole ecosystem of cloud services that are running on the internet, data centers, belonging to different vendors, maybe that exchange data, that analyze your data, that do some things with it in order to help you. So the question is also a little bit, what even does it mean to have a computer when the system boundaries are kind of becoming so blurry? So this have been some trends that we have observed. So that's, on the first hand, you could say this is very nice. But on the other hand, especially this last thing that we are dependent so much on these cloud infrastructures nowadays, and that there are so strong connections, also comes with a lot of problems that have been discussed under the umbrella term of this platform economy. And I'm sure you're all very aware of these problems that have been discussed in terms of digital sovereignty and these topics in the last years. So like in the platform economics, we have a little bit of the phenomenon that there is this winner takes it all perspective. That means that from an economic perspective, the value of computer networks is not so much the technical features they provide, but the number of users that you can reach over them. So that means that the biggest network is kind of the most powerful network, and it's very hard to have competing different networks for different things. And that also creates a very strong dependency on a few central actors. So these big tech companies that you are all aware with, who have this big data centers, they have all the data, they have all the user accounts, and they concentrate a lot of power, and it's very hard to get away from them. So there's a lot of dependencies. And of course, all these other economic mechanisms that have been discussed by Zuzana Zuboff in her book, very influential book on surveillance capitalism. So the question a little bit, so what does it mean that these companies know so much about us, that they have so much data about us, that they monitor every single step that we do on the internet and use it maybe for targeted advertising and other things? And there's a question how this could influence us in a way that we don't like. And this is also a topic that Veronica will talk to you in more detail in a few minutes when she presents her case study. So the question is a little bit now, remember, we are consumer informatics researchers, so what do we do about this? So our approaches are usually that we design supportive tools, that we try to make this all these problems a little bit more visible, to create more awareness about consumers, and help them also to enable their consumer rights. So GDPR is one big topic, which is a regulatory framework that you all know. And the question is a little bit, as a consumer, how can I make sure that I can also implement my rights? And there we build supportive tools. We also work together with people in consumer protection who are more interested in the regulation side, because we think that it's not just a technical problem that we can solve by building new tools again and again, but also where we have to think about standards and infrastructures, regulations. And yeah, we are also from a design side very interested in how we can develop better guidelines and concepts for privacy-friendly designs. But the problem is that there's so much development in these new trends and shifts in power and these platform economics and development of new devices that it's very hard to keep up with it. And we are often playing a little bit of a whack-a-mole game. And yeah, to illustrate this a little bit further, I would now hand over to Veronica for the next part of the presentation. And yeah, for now, would like to thank you for your attention. Veronica, your turn.
Yeah, so hi, now it's my turn to talk to you about our case study, which is basically dark patterns, and specifically dark patterns in extended reality, because as Alex mentioned, this is my focus, where I'm also doing my research on, and I'm usually super enthusiastic when I talk about it, so bear with me for the next couple of minutes. And I like to start with a quote from a paper that was the first paper published that attempted to structure the problems of dark patterns or describe dark patterns in a taxonomy, basically. And it's from Conti and Sobiesk, published in 2010. And they said, in an ideal world, interface design is the art and science of helping users accomplish tasks in a timely, efficient, and pleasurable manner. But now we have dark patterns, and they usually try to do exactly the opposite of it. But we will find out more in the next couple of minutes. So let's start with understanding what dark patterns actually are. Dark patterns are defined as tricks used in websites and apps, or also online services or digital services, that make you do things that you didn't mean to in order to benefit a person or a company or another third party that somehow gets benefits from you sharing your data with them, or you buying additional items, or you doing anything you didn't originally intend to do. So in order to call dark interface designs a dark pattern, they have to be applied multiple times in a similar way. Like, a pattern is usually also similar to a blueprint. So you apply it in a similar way to a similar problem. And so the solution always looks basically the same. Otherwise, if this hasn't happened yet, you cannot talk about dark interface designs as dark patterns. So patterns have to be reapplied multiple times. And why are they now problematic? So first of all, they can be really difficult to detect, especially if you're not a user interface design expert, like, for example, your grandma or your aunt or your uncle, like a normal person operating user interfaces is not a user interface design expert. And even if they are able to detect such manipulative behavior, those dark patterns are usually still effective. At least that's what a study that was published last year by Bongard and Blanchy showed. So dark patterns, even if we are able to recognize them, still take at least a certain amount of effect on us. Also, usually dark patterns are not formulated in a standardized way. This is also something we learned when we were doing our study. So it's really difficult to get a holistic overview of the dark patterns that are out there in the wild, because we have a lot of redundancy and a lot of things that seem to be a different pattern, but in fact, they are talking about the same behavior, for example. And this ambiguity also makes it difficult to regulate, because you can imagine if you have like 5,000 pattern descriptions, this is a large catalog. And if from those 5,000 dark patterns, maybe just 1,000 types exist, it's still difficult to get the overview and to find regulations that actually match all of those descriptions. So let's see what dark patterns do or how they work. And I brought to you taxonomy, which is focusing on strategies of dark patterns. And this is also the taxonomy we used in our research, because other than other taxonomies, it's not talking about implementation specific aspects. It's really just like the strategy dark patterns apply. And there are in general 5 different types. And first of all, a strategy often applied is called nagging, which is basically redirecting the expected functionality that persists beyond one or more interactions. And an example of a nagging dark pattern is one I experience every time I reboot my system, because I'm still using Windows 10. And of course, Microsoft wants me to update to Windows 11. So every time I restart my computer, I get this prompt, hey, please upgrade to Windows 11. It's so much better. And I cannot say no and don't bug me anymore. I can only say, okay, not right now. Remind me the next time I restart my PC. So I will have this prompt as long as I don't update to Windows 10, to Windows 11. But yeah, let's see. A second strategy is also called obstruction, which is describing how to, which is describing making a process more difficult than it needs to be with the intent of dissuading certain actions. And you probably already have experienced such patterns. For example, it's sometimes really easy to sign up to a service or to a functionality on a website like Amazon Prime, for example. But then again, it gets really difficult or bothersome when you want to delete your account, or if you want to sign out of such a service. For example, in the case of Amazon Prime, you have to click through several submenus with weird names and weird menu points, and you don't really understand why you should go there. And in the end, you still have to contact the customer service to ask them to delete your account because you cannot do it on your own. And this is a pattern also called roach motel, but the strategy behind it is obstruction. A third strategy is also called forced action, and is requiring the user to perform a certain action to access or continue to access a certain functionality. And you can think about it in the context of gaming, for example. So I'm not sure if you still played Farmville on Facebook, but they were basically implementing one of those patterns. Every time you wanted to upgrade your farm, you had to invite your friends, and your friends actually had to pay or had to play this game. Otherwise, you wouldn't get specific crops or specific animals or specific building materials. And so the game basically forced you to annoy your friends to play the game in order to advance. And this is a strategy also called forced action. A fourth strategy is called sneaking, and it's attempting to hide, disguise, or delay the divulging of information that is relevant to the user. So for example, if you shop for new shoes or something like this, and you put them in your shopping cart, and the platform secretly adds some care product you don't really want to have, but they just add it. And you will find out that they added it when you already proceeded and checked out. So you had to pay for a product you originally didn't want to buy, and they just added it and didn't inform you. And the final strategy I want to explain, I want to introduce to you is called interface interference, which is basically the manipulation of the user interface that privileges certain actions over others. And this is a pattern often applied in cookie banners where you have pre-selected features you actually don't want to have because you don't want to share your data, but because it's the default selection, you will maybe by accident just accept it and share your data with everybody who is interested in it. Also, disguised ads that look like content of a website are interface interference, and this is also one of the most applied patterns. Now, if we go back, or if you have a brief look at the history of dark patterns, because now you might think, okay, they are everywhere. How could this actually happen? This is a really interesting question. And also those manipulative designs, they root back they root far more back than just like dark patterns in interface design. For example, early practices in retail, like psychological pricing, is also such a manipulative design approach. When you have a price tag of 14.99 euros on an article instead of 15, it's perceived as being cheaper, and also users or consumers tend to remember that it was a cheaper price, so they probably buy more stuff because they think they just can afford more. And now when we go back to dark patterns, I already mentioned that they were first described in an attempt to provide a taxonomy in 2010. And this is also the year where the term dark pattern was coined by Harry Britnell. You probably heard about him because he's one of the activists in this case who proclaimed, okay, we cannot have such interface design practices. It's really not fair and for our users. It's not ethical in this case. We are basically abusing trust of our users, or we are abusing that our users are not really experienced with the technology. And he also came up with the strategy of naming and shaming companies that use dark patterns, because this was for a long time the only thing you could do in order to basically make it public that people are using dark patterns, which sounds really ridiculous because they were just everywhere, and they still are. But yeah, it took almost 10 years until the first legislative attempts were started, which was in 2021, at least according to my source material. There were the first mentions of dark patterns in legal restrictions or in legal attempts to regulate dark patterns. So this also means that legislation is still trying to pick up with the speed we have when it comes to technological development, when it comes to platform development, when it comes to creative ways of misusing our brain and tricking us to do stuff we don't want to. And in hindsight, you could say legislation just waited too long. So dark patterns were already established I don't know how to say this, they were established pretty well and everywhere before they even attempted to regulate it. And the attempts we have today, they are usually based on dark patterns we can observe, mostly in well-established user interfaces and services, for example, in e-commerce platforms and cookie banners. But what is happening when we have a technology where we cannot really observe how it behaves or how it is designed or how it is used in the wild, like we have with augmented and virtual reality, for example, or we also have with artificial intelligence? And this is a question, this is really interesting, and I'm going to answer in a few minutes. First of all, since I'm going to talk a lot about XR right now and augmented and virtual reality, I want to make sure that we are talking about the same thing. So I'll briefly introduce to you what augmented reality is, what virtual reality is, and why I call both of them XR. So let's start with the reality-virtuality continuum, which is one of the most cited frameworks or taxonomies when one attempts to explain what those kind of technologies are. And you have to imagine it like a spectrum ranging from the real environment surrounding you without any virtual alterations or virtual changes, to a fully virtually generated environment. And this is, just imagine it right now as a spectrum. And we now start to add digital artifacts to it, or digital objects. And then we are already in, or we can already talk about augmented reality in this context. So I brought you an example from my living room, and this is my husband checking out how the potentially new sofa might look like in our living room without us having to buy it, because stuff like this is heavy. And you can then, through a handheld device in this case, already see how the sofa might look like or integrate with your other furniture, and how the dimensions might fit in your space or in your room, and things like this. And as soon as you have basically virtual or digital objects that are anchored in space and somehow around you, you can talk about augmented reality, or you can call it augmented reality. Now, if we keep adding digital objects to our actual physical world, it gets more and more virtually generated. So we move from augmented reality to augmented virtual reality and end up in an environment or in a world that is fully virtually generated. And this is not only limited to the optical or the visual input you get, it's also spreading towards like your ears, for example, or tactile feedback you can receive is also virtually generated. So you're basically living or walking through a fully virtual world, and then we talk about virtual reality. And it usually looks like presented on the pictures below. So there's a person wearing glasses or a headset. Usually you cannot see through them because of course they have little screens in there, and they are usually holding or operating applications using those two controllers you have. And what those people see might look like the picture on the right side. So it's similar to a computer game, and the screenshot is from a game called Vader Immortal, which I like to play a lot. And the right arm you can see here is actually the user's right arm, and you can operate or steer this arm using the controller and your actual physical arm. So, and since we are talking about a spectrum, basically all the realities ranging from augmented reality to virtual reality and all the different kinds of virtual objects you can have in between are sometimes in science called mixed reality, and in industry and marketing based platforms, they are usually addressed as XR or extended realities. And I also, at least for this presentation, will use the term XR. So let's now compare briefly desktop UIs, or the classical UIs, how I used to call them, with XR UIs. What's the difference here? So you probably are right now watching this class or this lecture using a desktop device, or using a device that is really well defined with a screen, like physically defined with a screen. You're probably stationary, or you're at least sitting. You're not moving a lot, and as soon as you turn your head and basically look away from your screen, you will also not see the application anymore. This is slightly different when we move to XR. So you can imagine yourself being part of the interface, because it suddenly spans all around you. Objects can be above you, below you, behind you. They can be everywhere. But you can also be everywhere, at least in theory. So you can sit on a park bench, you can ride a bike, you can be in your living room and accidentally kicking your kid because you cannot see it since you're wearing VR glasses. And this is also, this is actually stuff that happens. So if you just go to YouTube and Google VR fails, you can often see people punching walls. So they actually get physically hurt, because this is just a different type of interacting with systems. So this also means that XR UIs are usually prone to unexpected situations, because it's difficult to foresee every potential situation that might happen as soon as a person is standing up and walking around and leaving their safe space, their safe office, and basically go outside. And yeah, and it just makes it complex, because you also have to foresee potential effects on users as well as bystanders. And yeah, I was originally, so now you know how XR UIs work, and let's continue with how it actually, or what kind of manipulations might happen when we pair XR with dark patterns. So first of all, I want to show you how we perceive our world, or how we understand our world works. So let's start with our brain as our computing platform, which is taking input from multiple sensors. In this case, sensors are, of course, our eyes, for example, so we can see stuff, our ears to hear things, our skin or hands, so we can feel like temperature, pain, touch, or force, and our nose and tongue, so we can also taste and smell things. Those are basically our biological sensors we have in order to perceive the world. Now, when we perceive the world, we perceive several things. For example, the layout of the surrounding world, or ourselves, which is also called own body perception, ourselves in relation to the surrounding space, which is called proprioception. Then we perceive balance, we perceive motion, we perceive times, and just a lot of things. And I'd like to skip over the models that actually explain how the human brain works, because I don't have enough time to do this. Instead, let's focus on what XR offers, or how XR feeds information to those sensors we have. So I like to introduce, in this case, two main aspects of XR technology. The first one is called immersion, which is the objective degree to which a VR system and application project stimuli onto the sensory receptors of users. This means that immersion is hardware induced, and the better your hardware is, the more easy it is to get immersed in the system, basically. Immersion has several aspects, and I just briefly mentioned two of them. The first one is extensiveness, which is basically the range of sensory modalities presented to the user. This means, are we only using visual input? Are we also using oral input or oral feedback? Are we using tactile input? And so on and so forth. So we could imagine, in an ideal VR system, we could overlay all the sensors we have with virtually generated content, or virtually generated stimuli. The second one I want to mention briefly is surroundness, which is the extent to which cues are panoramic. Is the interface actually surrounding us? Do we use the peripheral vision, for example? Or do we only use things, or can we only see and perceive things that are right in front of us? Of course, an interface that surrounds us feels or enables to be immersed more easily. The second thing I want to mention, and you probably already heard a lot, is presence, which is basically the sense of being there, or when we talk about VR applications, it's the sense of being part of the VR application. And this is an internal psychological and physiological state of the user. This also means you cannot design presence, because a user has to feel presence, but you can design, or you can make it more easy to feel present in a VR application. So this means the greater the immersion, the greater the potential for a user to feel present in a virtual environment. Of course, this also somehow means the better your hardware, the more likely it is that you feel present in a virtual environment. So now let's mess a little bit with our understanding of reality, because we have only one objective reality that basically no one has ever experienced, because we are human beings that interpret reality. We interpret everything we see just because our brain works like that. So what does this mean? Objective reality in this case would be the world as it exists, independent of any conscious entity observing it. But what we perceive as reality, as I already mentioned, is subjective. Because even if we do not wear XR headsets or anything else, our brain is always filtering for us aspects that are perceived as relevant. For example, our brain constructs our own reality based on what we perceive with our sensors and have learned in the past. Or it might also, like the reality we perceive, might also be based on or influenced by what we think we know. For example, if we interpret pictures, it might happen based on shapes and persons or people we recognize. And this is something you often have when you see perceptual illusions like this one, this raven-rabbit illusion. Some people see a raven, other people see a rabbit. And if you know the picture has the potential to show both, you also will develop the skill to see both of them. Also, what we perceive might be influenced by what we expect to do. For example, if you drink milk, but expect to drink orange juice, milk tastes really strange, even though we usually like it, for example. And I like to emphasize that XR has the potential to override our sensorial input. So it might be able to construct a completely different completely new reality that might be super personal, and we are the only ones who can actually see it, because of course not all applications are multi-user applications. So you can also be just an individual living in a virtual world and experiencing just one specific type of reality. So this means XR, in theory at least, bears a lot of potential for very effective dark patterns. And this is because, of course, experts have learned this like years ago. They also call for early intervention and regulation of dark patterns in XR, so that we do not end up with a situation we had like 10 years ago, when the only possible or potential thing we could do was naming and shaming companies, as I mentioned earlier. But now we have something like a dilemma, because we want to regulate a technology that is not yet there, so we really cannot predict how it behaves and how it affects people. But if we wait too long, we lose control over this technology. So our goal is basically to find this ideal area of intervention. And this is actually quite difficult. So one solution you could do is just being aware that such a dilemma exists. And try to counter, or to try to counter this dilemma before it happens, or at least try to do your best to make your predictions as realistic as possible. And this now leads to, or now I want to present to you my latest research regarding dark patterns and how we tackle this Collingridge dilemma. I have to say it's unpublished research, so I cannot go into too much detail, but if you're interested, just drop me a message and I will share the paper with you as soon as I'm allowed to share it publicly. And I am also happy to talk about it, so just drop me a message. Yeah, but let's go back to the Collingridge dilemma and how we addressed it. So what we did, we recruited 20 experts. 10 of them were experts in the field of XR, and the other 10 were experts in the field of ethical design. The people, or the experts of XR design or XR application design, we recruited based on published applications. They, for example, published at ACM CHI or ACM UIST, which are really famous and well-known and renowned conferences in our field. And they had to have a working application. So we could already see this is a potential use case, and you can already accomplish such a use case with the hardware we have today and with the software we have today. And we paired them in 10 little workshops. So we always had two people. One was the XR expert, the other one was the deceptive design expert or the ethical design expert. And we just asked them, what are possible dark pattern scenarios in XR based on the application you implemented and based on the application that already works? And our participants said the answer is 42, because they delivered basically 42 scenarios that were depicting potential patterns or potential dark patterns in XR technology and how it might affect people in the future. So we analyzed it and we identified in total 4 clusters of XR properties that might be used in order to manipulate users, or that might be used in order to create dark patterns. For example, factors addressing the spatiality of a system. So you could imagine to place virtual objects or virtual buttons slightly out of reach. So your participant or your person or your user has to get up and walk over there. And maybe walking over there is impossible because they have to cross Autobahn, or they have to get up from their comfy sofa and leave their chips and their interesting movie behind. So this is one potential dark pattern, just puts things slightly out of reach, so people have to get up and walk there. But I will explain later a little scenario I really like, where they purposefully used whole body interaction and intrinsic gestural meaning in order to influence the user's decision. And this was more manipulating our morality or how we perceive actions. So now if we recall dark patterns, we have to have a beneficiary, but we also have to have a business model behind it. So of course, if you manipulate users, you somehow want to get something out of it, because otherwise, why would you do all the efforts in manipulating people and hiding it and pretending nothing happened? So of course, manipulations have to be subtle enough to not be recognized, because when they are obvious, people will just stop using your applications. It doesn't make any sense if you, I don't know, if it's just like easy to spot and people are like, nah, why should I use it? It's going against what I actually want to do. But then again, those manipulations have to be effective enough to actually have some impact at least. So if you manipulate people and they just don't care, it doesn't work too. So yeah. Also, business models need to be lucrative, but not damaging a company's reputation, because if you get famous for manipulating and abusing users, this is also probably something you don't want to do, because people will stop buying your stuff or will stop using your things. So we had some scenarios, at least, that were implausible because they were too obvious or the effects were too grave. For example, users in this potential scenarios, they died. And as soon as you have people dying because they use your applications, also this is slightly problematic, I would say. So still, we found 39 adapted patterns, and adapted in this case means they are dark patterns we can already see in other applications we have. For example, dark patterns in e-commerce platforms, or dark patterns in social media platforms, or dark patterns like that. And they were just adapted to also work in XR. And this was possible, and it was possible, or it didn't take a lot of effort to adapt them in this way. And we also found 10 XR specific pattern candidates that might work only in XR, because you have to do, for example, a lot of manipulations, or a lot of, you have to make use of spatiality, for example, in order for this manipulation to work. So what is now the problem with XR as a technology? You might have figured already, XR needs a lot of information about the surrounding world in order to at least work. So, for example, we need contextual information. We need information about the user themselves, like biometric data, how far the eyes, for example, are apart, because you can only create this 3D effect if you know exactly how far the eyes are apart. You also need to know about the height of your person in order to properly scale up or down your interfaces. You probably need to have location data, which might be based on GPS tracking data, but it might also be based on computer vision algorithms that interpret buildings, for example, and then recognize buildings based on a large image database, and then know exactly that you are right now in New York looking at the Statue of Liberty. So this is also possible. And you need spatial information like the depth of your rooms, the height of your rooms, where your furniture is, for example, where tables are, if there's a person walking through your space or not. So this is so all of this information is collected. And if you now pair it with AI or artificial intelligence, you might get super dark patterns that are highly personalized and really fit well to you as a person. For example, we could imagine targeted ads that match your reaction speed. So, for example, you want to get rid of the ad, but it is just slightly fast enough to move, and then you accidentally click on a button you actually didn't intend to. And since it's your personal reaction speed, you cannot really do anything against it. But there are also other things that might be hyper-personalized or super-personalized. Like this example I brought to you, which is called Crush This Puppy to Decline. And it's an actual example based on a scenario we had in our recent research study. And it's an example of a moral dilemma and also a highly personalized dark pattern, because the person you see here, they are wearing a VR headset. And in order to decline an offer they actually do not want to take, they have to crush this poor puppy. And unfortunately, of course, they like puppies. They do not want to step on such a cute puppy, which was also displayed in a photorealistic way. And it was behaving like a real puppy and super personalized. And they just knew which strings they have to pull in order for this person to fall in love with this puppy. So they felt really emotionally attached to it, and it was impossible, or at least really difficult, for them to decline or crush this puppy in this scenario. Also, I want to mention the sketch is created by DALL-E based on a scenario description of the scenario I just mentioned. And if you're not familiar with it, but DALL-E is also an artificial intelligence that produces sketches and images based on text input. So yeah, what does this mean? Actually, regulating emerging technologies is really difficult. But still we have to do it because we don't want to end up with a technology that is super adapted and full of manipulative things that harm users. So the question is how to anticipate social and ethical implications. And if you're at some point in a situation where you have to do this, always keep the Collingwood dilemma in mind. And also be aware that it's probably impossible to already know how such a technology might behave in the future, but you can at least learn about some potential ways it might work. Also, regulating is not only a technical problem, but also regulation, for example, needs to discuss contextual and social environments. We probably need new methods, we need new approaches. We also need to identify applicable regulations. And it also means that we probably have to establishing standards, for example, a standardized way of describing a dark pattern in this case. And this brings me to my last slide, because it's also our dilemma: who is responsible for not falling victim to dark patterns, or who is responsible to protect people, or who is responsible to regulate stuff, or who is responsible to not implement dark patterns? It's really a difficult question. And since we are talking about, or since our perspective is always consumer-centered, or mostly consumer-centered, I would say, actually we want to empower consumers and enable them to protect themselves, but we do not want to blame the responsibility solely on them, because that would be super unfair, and you actually cannot expect a person to safely operate a car without a steering wheel, for example. So we also have to address those problems in the context of companies who are producing software or who are producing applications, and of course also in the context of legal regulations. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you're still here. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Hello, Veronica, Alex. Wow, that was very informative, very clear, but also introduces into a whole new conversation. I really like the concept or the dark patterns and even the super dark patterns. I think it's very productive to think in a sense of how can we find areas of leverage. No, you call it ideal area of intervention. We are thinking about it in kind of points of leverage. No? I have a couple of questions, but also if people have questions, I also can read them and either Alex or Veronica can answer. My question is, do you call dark pattern only like the things that are by design, like they are in the interface, or for example, the ones that cohesive consumers because of comfort or because they have to use it? For example, we are here in Zoom and no one had the right to say, no, I actually don't want to use Zoom. Or I have to work in Microsoft, or my community event is in Facebook. But also in terms of AI design, most of the already trained databases are trained already by companies that you don't know, you cannot certify where is this data come from and how this AI is trained. So can we call also that dark patterns, or that's a different thing?
So in my understanding, it's a different thing, because one you could call a company policy, for example. So if you are in an ecosystem where everybody has to use Zoom, this I would say is not a dark pattern. But if you are also, because it's not, well, dark patterns aim to manipulate a user to do things they originally didn't intend to. So they have to be applied with having this in mind. So you have to have a beneficiary that actually somehow has something from forcing you to do actions you don't want to. And in the example, at least you mentioned, a company policy wouldn't be a designed dark pattern, at least in my understanding.
Okay. No, it's just if we're going to start using this concept, I think we will in the studio, just to have that very clear.
Yeah, I think Alex, sorry, I think Alex wanted to add to this part.
No, I just I just unmuted myself in case.
Okay.
But yeah, I would actually agree. I would not call that a dark pattern, but of course standards matter a lot. And I mean, this dark pattern concept is also related to this concept of nudging that has been discussed a lot in the last years because of this Nobel Prize in behavioral economics. So like where they see like how the structures of our world influences in subtle ways, and usually this is understood in a paternalistic way. So like how can you nudge people to behave better, waste less energy, or behave themselves in a better way, but you can also abuse these mechanisms, which is what we see, I think, in this dark patterns case. But it's always some kind of manipulation involved, and not so much like just that the default standard is something else.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna start reading questions from the audience. So, Alex, you didn't grow this, Alex, no? I guess it's another Alex. You mentioned name and shame and regulations as two effective ways of establish standards and control tech innovation. What are other ways in which tech companies can be influenced? Actually, that was my second question that I have written. You were talking about the Colindrich dilemma in terms of regulation. But yeah, if it's no regulation, we also consider regulation goes much slower than the technical development. If it's not regulation, what other ways can we think about?
Yeah, so there are actually different opinions about this. And one is naming and shaming, I would say, is not probably not the most effective method you could apply, but it was for a long time the only method that could be applied because no one was really attempting to regulate this. And you have this, I would say, contradicting interests of companies because they, of course, want to earn money, but also of users who, of course, want to stay safe and not be manipulated in a way. So I think companies will always come up with ways to somehow get money out of the applications. Of course, this makes sense. And regulating those attempts or regulating how technology is used might be the most effective one, but as you said, it might also be the slowest one. So another approach, which is often mentioned in literature at least, is educating designers. But then, of course, you cannot blame this responsibility on designers alone, because they are embedded in a network or in a field out of company policies. They are probably in hierarchy or like a power discrepancy situation. Is this how you call it? So they are depending on the company owners or on the employers because they want to earn money. So they are not probably not in charge of making ethical decisions in the design process. But of course, educating designers to not apply those patterns or how to approach having to design for such a thing might also be an effective case or an effective approach you could use.
Yeah, I think the problem in this extent is really, so what we said in the beginning of the talk, this power of platforms or a few very powerful central actors that are really hard to get away from. I think with a little bit more competition, it would be, like, in theory at least, a better situation for us, but they are getting away with so many things that regulation seems to be the straightforward thing. But of course, having, like, showing that other business models can also be successful, also building trust in your brand by being very transparent, very open, very fair to your users. So like that this could also be like an incentive, I would hope, at least, for companies to acquire users.
And if I add also educating users, I recall that you started your presentation with saying, like, your auntie or your granny will not even notice these dark patterns. But maybe companies are getting away with them because part of their users are not even aware of they have been manipulated. I also, so it's like education, not just of the designers, but in the general publics, and kind of supporting more sustainable conducts in the way that we actually live. No? I have another question from Maria from the floor. I don't know if I understand the question, but I will read it to you and let's see if we can make sense together. Not sure if this relates, but how can you link design and AI? Like, what is the role of the designer? If, for example, they were creating a digital influencer, how are they helping brands? I don't know if the digital influencer is a AI generated influencer or is it a real influencer? And yeah,
So
I don't know.
I think the question is addressing one of those artificial intelligence influencers, which are basically a generated model with a generated behavior behind it. I hope
Yes.
I got this correctly.
Yes,
Can you
Maria just answered that. It's the digital, yeah.
Okay, can you then repeat the question? Because I was now so hung up on understanding it that I missed the question.
Yeah. Not sure, Maria, if you want to rewrite the question because it's not very clear, but it's how can you link design and AI? Like, what is the role of the designer if, for example, they were creating a digital influencer? Who is they? And how are they helping brands? Do you mean designers or I don't understand? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can skip the question and give the person who asked it the
Yes, you can kind of
option to rephrase it.
Yeah, rephrase, Maria, so we can read it. The next question is kind of actually part of the brief of this whole award, and is how could you design support? How could design support making of regulation of AI and technology? They're also thanking you for your presentation and your sharing.
Yeah, this is actually an interesting question. Especially when we are talking about technologies that are still emerging, because we do not know the full potential yet. So how can design support us? Of course, in designing applications and designing manifold applications and design really diverse applications and try to, for example, apply things we already know about accessibility, about how an interface should work, about how our human brain works, and also find out what actually doesn't work and find out what we actually shouldn't do. So if we identify maybe a really manipulative way as a designer, we should probably say, hey, I found this. We probably shouldn't use it, but this is how it works. Now, please do something against it. This could be one potential approach.
So that means it should be like a consumer protection role within the whole innovation process, or it should be like this sort of position within, I don't know, technology development projects, or yeah.
Yeah, so what I think is really essential for a designer to develop is somehow a sense of is what we are doing still in our ethical framework? So does it still fit, or is it stuff we shouldn't do? And as soon as you figure out how technology might abuse those ethical frameworks we have, or how it might abuse our understanding of fairness, of inclusivity, for example, we should definitely make people aware of it.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
And if I could add on this, I mean, the main dilemma, so I'm not a legal expert, but so one of the main dilemmas, as far as I understand it, is that regulation moves so slow, right? So like we have the GDPR now, but that has been 20 years in the making, and it had to be built in a way that's really vague in terms of how it's actually put into practice, because otherwise, if you would have made it too concrete, it would now already be outdated again, and that means we shift a lot of responsibility later to how to interpret the things that are in there in terms of the modern technology. And I think this is the way where designers can play a very important role by demonstrating what are possible good approaches for towards a good regulation, a good standardization, how to interpret these things, how to move them forward. Because in the end, what we will need probably is like we do user-centered design nowadays, as a common practice. So we work together with user. Maybe we also need some user-centered regulation, and there I think designers could play a very important role as translators, as demonstrators of possible pitfalls, like Veronica is doing in her work, but also to show good practices and good patterns. And
I'd also like to add to this because What I think is also really important is that we get rid of our understanding of user-centered design for like in the context of you're only designing for a single user, because as I showed earlier, technology spans a lot more than just the people directly interacting with it. So we also need to provide applicable or practical guidelines and practical methods, and stuff like this doesn't come from nowhere. So we have to develop them. And I think this is also somehow a task designers could and should approach.
Yes, I'm happy with the we call it more like community distributed design instead of user-centered, to kind of get rid of this idea of this lonely person sitting in the living room. I'm aware that the time is off, but I really wanted to thank you. Thank you for your sharing. I think it's been very informative. And I invite all these designers that are listening to us and they're thinking about the projects, for example, explore how you can design for offering and not offering, or giving and taking consent, for example. That is not a GDPR ticking box, or that sort of things. I hope this lecture was inspiring for everyone. I'm sure it's going to be inspiring for everyone. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Veronica. It was an honor to have you today, and I keep you in the loop with what we generate after this program of companion lectures of the award. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Great questions too. Bye-bye.
Bye.